Hi, everyone. This is Helen Rosenfeld. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Science and Engineering Fair. Excited to have you all join us this afternoon. We have a great speaker series, and today's speaker is Sean Cotton from a company called Synlogic. This is a series that we implemented as a way for you to hear about different people's career paths and decision-making along that path. And with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sean. Thanks for joining us today, Sean.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen quickly and throw up a slide. Hopefully everyone can see that now. So thanks for joining. Just going to take you through some of my background, education-wise, and then also professionally, and then maybe talk a little bit about what I currently do for my work at Synlogic as a strain engineer, and then happy to take any questions that anyone has as we go through. And feel free to stop me and ask me questions too, or ask any questions in the chat. I don't mind taking a break so I don't just talk for 15, 20 minutes straight. Yeah, so I went to undergrad at Brandeis University in Waltham, Mass, from 2001 to 2005. And then I actually ended up working there for a couple years in the lab that I did my senior thesis research in. So really enjoyed the work that I've been doing the last couple years of my undergrad career, and was sort of on the fence about what to do after I graduated. I had started studying for the MCAT because I thought that med school was going to be my path at that point. But I hadn't actually taken the test yet and wanted to sort of give myself a little bit of time to see if maybe research was where I wanted to end up. I had been working in the lab for a couple of years at that point, and sort of really got into just being a bench scientist, and really enjoyed that work and asking questions and being able to sort of guide my own research. So I stayed for a couple of years after that, applied to medical school during that time, went through that whole process, took the MCAT, did interviews, and then ended up not getting in to medical school. So that sort of decided that for me. That was kind of a blow, honestly, because that had been sort of my plan since I was probably a freshman in high school, was to go to medical school. That had been my dream. That was sort of where I had hoped to be after completing undergrad, but it wasn't meant to be. And then sort of around the same time, the professor that I was working for at Brandeis did not get tenure at the university. So he actually left Brandeis and went to University of Rochester, which was sort of ironic because I was from Buffalo. I came from upstate New York. I did not want to go back home to the Western New York area, and knew that sort of biotech in general was sort of at a peak in Boston and was really taking off around that time. So I decided to stay in the area and started looking for jobs. It was sort of a two-pronged approach. I looked for teaching jobs because I wasn't sure 100% if I wanted to stay in the lab. So I looked for chem, bio, physics, math teacher jobs all around the Metro West area, mostly at private schools because I wasn't a state certified teacher at that point. So that was really my only option, was to work at a private school. And I had been tutoring for a company on the side for a bit at that point as well. So it sort of got me in the door with some families that had kids and had students that were at a lot of these sort of prep schools in the Metro West area. And then the other prong of that was I looked for other sort of research tech, research assistant jobs, and that's how I landed at Forsyth. So the Forsyth Institute is a small nonprofit research institute that focuses on oral health and oral biology research. There's an operating dental clinic there. Up until about the 80s, there used to be a dental hygienist school as well. And it's sort of loosely affiliated with Harvard Dental School still to this day. So I joined a microbiology lab there and sort of got on from the ground up on a small sort of little business venture that one of the PIs was starting, where we sold a service that ID'd bacteria in oral samples. So people would send us saliva samples or plaque samples or blood samples, and then we would ID the bacteria that were in them. And we started a sort of a small little for-profit business out of the lab while we did research at the same time. And then after I'd been there for a couple of years, I decided that I should probably get at least a graduate degree of some sort if I wanted to stay in the science field and sort of move up, you know, possibly becoming a principal investigator or running a lab myself. Sort of became a realization that I needed to have at least another degree besides just a bachelor's. So I was very fortunate that my PI allowed me to apply to graduate school and still continue to work full time. And I was able to get into this really interesting program that BU has. And as far as I know, it's pretty much the only program in the country that is like this. It's called LEAP, which is a Late Entry Accelerated program. I think the acronym is right, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was for non-engineers who had really a variety of backgrounds that wanted to get into engineering of any sort. So it's sort of like a catch-up program. So you take a couple of undergrad classes, depending on what your background was in, and then you apply to the engineering graduate school, either to get a master's degree or to get a PhD. And at that point, I thought that I was going to get a PhD. So I applied to that and was accepted. So started that in 2009, went through that. And then in 2011, I actually applied to the PhD program after I had finished that sort of early part of the LEAP program at BU, was accepted to that, and then left my job very briefly at Forsyth to join a lab at Boston University. So unfortunately, the connection that I had made with the PI whose lab I started in just sort of broke down very quickly. I knew after maybe a month or two in the lab there that it wasn't a good fit for me, and that getting a PhD actually probably didn't make the most sense for where I wanted to go, especially in engineering. I think a lot of times if you want to end up in industry, having a PhD can be somewhat harmful in the sense that you are overly trained. And if you're going to get a job as an engineer for a company, most of the time that company is going to teach you how to do most of, if not all of, the engineering that you're going to do for them on the job. So having a PhD, unless I wanted to run my own lab or start my own company, didn't make the most sense. So I sort of backed out of the PhD program and ended up with a master's of engineering instead, which I think in the end was really the way to go. So instead of a master's of science, which is kind of more common, I think, for science backgrounds, a master's of engineering, at least at BU, required you to take a couple of business related classes or sort of process classes where you understand how things are made and how things go through supply chain. One of the classes that I ended up taking as part of the business part of that curriculum was how to value technology, how to put a price on something that comes out of a lab, that someone has an idea, and then how do you turn that into something that becomes a medicine or a product or a service. So sort of, happenstance, the professor that I took that with ended up starting a committee at Forsyth, where I was still currently working, to start evaluating the technology that was coming out of the labs at Forsyth. So I started working alongside him, doing some technology evaluation as I continued working in the micro lab that I had been in. So fast forward a couple of years, I'd been doing that for a while, helped with some patenting for the institute, and then had a really interesting invention disclosure from one of the researchers at Forsyth come across my desk. He was a postdoc at the time, so sort of one step below the principal investigator or the professor that runs a lab. had a really cool idea for how to make tools that other researchers could use to work with bacteria that we may, know something about, but we don't really know a ton about them because we can't work with them in the lab. So jumped onto that, got really excited about that, and ended up joining his lab after he established his own lab at Forsyth. And then sort of similar to my story at Brandeis, he left the Institute in 2019. So once I knew that was happening, I started to think about, okay, do I want to stay in this sort of academic nonprofit world, or do I want to move into industry and think about translating some of the research that I've been doing over the years and some of the knowledge that I had for how to value technology into something where I could actually work on a project and then take it into the clinic or take it into the market where a consumer could buy it. So that's what led me to Synlogic. I started there about 1.5 years ago and haven't looked back, and have really, really enjoyed my time at Synlogic so far as a strain engineer. So what that means as far as my title goes, we work on a probiotic strain of E. coli, which hopefully most people have probably heard of E. coli. Generally, when you hear about it, it's not in a good sense. You often hear about E. coli outbreaks from like romaine lettuce or spinach or something like that in grocery stores. So we work on a good strain of E. coli, though, that doesn't have any harmful side effects. And it's actually sold as a probiotic in Europe. It's just not on the market here. So we take that strain and we engineer pathways, biological pathways into that strain that it wouldn't otherwise have. So our main program right now, which we're actually in the clinic with, is a strain that is helping or intended to help patients with PKU, which is phenylketonuria. It's a genetic disease where you're not able to make a certain protein that breaks down proteins, essentially. So when you eat any protein in your diet, there are proteins in your intestines that break them down into smaller pieces, and then your body is able to digest them and use them for other things. So people with PKU don't have the ability to do that. So what we did was we took those enzymes or enzymes similar to those proteins that we would normally have in our intestines, and we put them inside of the probiotic strain of E. coli, so that when you start to break down proteins and that byproduct starts to build up and is starting to become toxic, the bacteria senses that, takes in that metabolite and makes it into something that's not toxic anymore, and then excretes it, and then you can go on your daily life, and you're none the wiser, because the thing that used to be toxic is no longer bad for you, because the bacteria has changed it into something else. So like I said, we're in the clinic with that right now. We're about to start some phase 2 clinical trials, and we have a couple of new programs that are up and coming. We have another program in the clinic that's sort of earlier on, and then I'm working on a new project that I can't talk too much about, just because of IP concerns and patenting concerns. So we haven't divulged that to the public yet. So I can sort of talk broadly about that if anyone has questions in a little bit, but I can't tell you exactly what it is that we're working on. But yeah, so that's sort of my trajectory and how I ended up at Synlogic and sort of where I've been. So happy to start the discussion from here and take any questions that anyone might have.
Great. So what I failed to mention at the beginning of this was, everyone who's joined, please feel free to either enter your questions in the chat function, or if you want to take yourself off mute, you can take your video and audio off mute and ask a question directly. So I will start the Q&A with my own, but appreciate your questions following, and I will facilitate. So Sean, maybe you can share a little bit about learning on the job versus the background knowledge that you need to have a job. So for example, with Synlogic, did you know a lot about E. coli or about PKU or some other aspect of that work, and what the difference is between what you've brought to your work versus what you get taught on the job?
Great question. Yeah, so I actually hadn't done a ton of work with E. coli specifically. It's a good go-to lab organism, so I had worked with it a little bit. It's great for cloning things in, and to work with in the lab and to express certain proteins or enzymes. But it wasn't, I guess, my sort of organism of choice. Save for no other reason that I didn't do a ton of plating and working with bacteria specifically. I did a lot more molecular biology work. So isolating DNA and sequencing DNA and RNA. So the bacterial or the E. coli specific piece was somewhat new, but I think a lot of the day-to-day lab stuff was pretty familiar to me at that point. I had been working in labs for I would say almost 15 years at that point before I joined Synlogic. So a lot of the bench work, doing things like PCR, polymerase chain reaction, or, like I said, isolating DNA, or, even just plating bacteria, that was all pretty familiar to me. What I think has been new is a lot more of the sort of synthetic biology tools that we use at Synlogic. I had started to do some of that in my work at Forsyth, maybe towards the end, the last year or two. And I think that was a large part of the reason that I was able to get the job at Synlogic, is that, I had started sort of working in this field of synthetic biology using CRISPR and tools like that. So some of the things that we use at Synlogic were new to me, but I had a little bit of experience, just sort of, trying to get in genes or proteins into cells where they shouldn't normally be, using tools, that have been developed over the last maybe 10, 15 years. Even something like CRISPR, which is relatively new, that's something that we are starting to use more and more, I think, across the industry as a whole, because it's so easy to use.
Great, thanks. We have a question here from Mantra. I am interested in a career in biotech, but unsure which undergraduate major to take. For example, biology versus biochem versus molecular cellular biology. How did you choose your undergrad major?
Great question, Mantra. So I was a just straight biology major at Brandeis. I think one of the reasons was because I think for biochemistry, I would have had to take physical chemistry, which I had heard horror stories about from some of my other friends that were either chemistry or physics majors. And to me, it didn't seem the most relevant for what I wanted to do. And especially at that point, I was still thinking about going to medical school. So I think that's why bio made the most sense to me. But I think some of that stemmed from even earlier. I would like to attribute most of the reason that I'm in science to my high school biology teacher that I had in 9th grade, and then again in 12th grade for AP Bio. So she was just probably the best teacher that I have had in my entire educational career. And I think because that class was biology made the most sense to me. So looking at what I do now, though, at Synlogic, I think biochemistry probably would have been the most helpful, even though I took a class or two in that as part of my major. I think having a little bit more background in biochemistry for what we do specifically at Synlogic, where we're expressing a lot of enzymes to degrade toxic metabolites, just having a deeper knowledge of some of those pathways, I think would have been more helpful. But I think whether you take bio or biochemistry or molecular biology, I think it's going to be dependent on the university or college that you go to, honestly. So, some might have more specific majors than others. But I think most of the core classes will be pretty similar. So I think don't necessarily force yourself into having a specific major set when you set foot on campus the first day of your undergrad career, because you might find that there's something else that that actually interests you a little bit more, you might switch from chem to physics or from chemistry to biology. So I think go in with an open mind. And one other thing that I would definitely advocate for, and knowing this for myself too, I'm a little aged at this point, and maybe computer science and coding and computational biology weren't where they are at now when I was an undergrad, but I can't stress enough how important it is to be computer literate in any science field at this point. So the more computational biology experience that you have, regardless of what your other major is, I think the better you're going to set yourself up for, because more and more of the work that I do is intricately related to using computers, and whether it's building software or using software to build pieces of DNA or proteins or whatever it might be. That would be my recommendation.
Thanks. And I think this is a good follow-up question from Dominique. In retrospect, would you change your career or educational path, either lengthwise or route-wise?
Yes. So if I could go back and talk to, I guess, junior year Sean, I would tell him to go into biomedical engineering, probably right off the bat. I probably would not have gone to Brandeis because they don't have engineering. You can probably find some engineering classes there, but there's really no engineering major there. So I probably would have gone to a completely different undergrad school. And I think I probably wouldn't have spent such a large chunk of time in between undergrad and going back to graduate school. Although I think that was, for me, helpful to sort of set where I actually wanted to be professionally. I think having that lag in time in some ways made it harder to go back to school for my graduate degree. Although on the flip side of that, I think it made me appreciate school a little bit more, that I had taken some time in between, and I had worked for a little bit, sort of knew what it was like to be out in the working world, having a paycheck. But again, I was lucky that I was able to go to graduate school at the same time that I had a full-time job. I don't think that is sort of the case for most people and for most people's trajectory. I don't know if I would have gotten a PhD though, still, even if I had kept going right from undergrad to graduate school. Yeah, I honestly, I don't know if I would have changed that. I think the education that I got between my bachelor's and my master's, I think was more than enough to prepare me for the work that I have done over the last decade plus in science. So whether or not the PhD would have been that much more helpful, I don't know. I don't think so. Aside from, if I ever wanted to start my own company, it might be a little bit easier if I had a PhD after my name. But even in that case, I don't know 100% the answer to that.
Thanks. A question from Alex. You talked a little bit about things not turning out as you expected with different professors or lab leaders leaving, which impacted your work. Can you share a little bit about what you've learned from that, or how you might have made your decisions differently?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, when I experienced that the first time with my PI at Brandeis not getting tenure, to sort of see the devastation in his, in his eyes, in his face when that day happened after he had given his seminar, his tenure talk, which most universities usually require you to give to be able to qualify for tenure. When he knew that he wasn't getting that was sort of heartbreaking to see that happen, knowing that he had had such a great educational background himself, had been doing really great research at Brandeis, had published in some top tier journals, and then for the university to say, sorry, we just don't want you here anymore, and for him to have to uproot his life and sort of change where he had thought he was going to spend probably most of his life in the Boston area, was really eye-opening. And I think part of that experience sort of made me shy away a little bit from getting a PhD, knowing that, for the most part, well, I guess maybe not for the most part, but if I had gone the PhD route, I probably would have stayed in academia. To put that amount of sort of time and effort in, and then just sort of jump ship to go to industry, to me, didn't really make sense. So if I had gotten a PhD, I probably would have stayed in academia. But to see sort of that life and that reality when you're sort of tied to a university and whether or not you have tenure, definitely made me rethink the plan a little bit.
I'm wondering, perhaps you can share what tenure is for those who are on,
Yeah,
in case they don't know.
Yeah. So I would say probably most universities, colleges, tenure is sort of this, I guess, sort of like a job guarantee. Usually after some kind of 3 to 5 year period, any researcher, any PI, or someone that runs a lab will have the opportunity to get tenure from the university, wherein they sort of have job security until they want to retire. So where their lab will be established, they'll have funding from the university, and regardless of their sort of funding status, which is often for a lot of academics intricately tied to the government, which is another thing that I got to see as well. So having NIH funding be the thing that pays your bills, that pays your salary for the lab, pays all the people in your lab salary, and then also pays for all of the supplies that you need to do your research. So having tenure sort of takes a lot of that pressure off. And so for new professors, new principal investigators, whenever they join a university at the beginning, they usually don't have tenure right away. So you sort of work for a couple of years, you also teach on the side. And then once you've sort of proven yourself to the university as an asset, as a, whether that's a great teacher or a great researcher or a combination of both of those things, most of the time you can then apply for tenure, and whether or not you get it is another question, but you at least have that option to then sort of say, yes, I want to stay here. Or, sometimes people know at that point that they're not a good fit for that university or college anymore, and then they'll move to a different university or college, or maybe they'll leave academia and move to industry.
Great, thanks for that. We have a question about finding people who helped guide you in high school. So I guess the question is around how did you find people to sort of help your decision-making as you both thought about college and then onwards?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, I really credit a lot of my drive to be a scientist, to be in science, to my high school biology teacher, Mrs. Reinhold. Really, just fantastic lady, can't say enough about her. I just was put in her class, as you are as a high schooler, right? You're just given a schedule, and that's who your teachers are generally, unless something catastrophic happens and you're able to or need to change your schedule. So I took 9th grade bio with her, and sort of along the way, maybe within the first marking period or so, a few of my friends and I got to know her a little bit better because we had joined science club. And then we also, my high school had what was called Science Olympiad. I'm assuming some of you are familiar with that. I think it's a program in Massachusetts as well. I think it's a national thing. So a few of us decided to join the Science Olympiad team and got to work more closely with her because she was one of the mentors for that team, as were a couple of the other science teachers. So I think I just sort of ingrained myself into the sciences at the high school that I went to. And I'm, again, super thankful that, aside from Mrs. Reinhold, my bio teacher, there was a couple of other great chem and physics teachers as well that I got to have as teachers as I was there. So, doing Science Olympiad and getting sort of that competition part of science involved. And then also my senior year, we started doing Envirothon, which I think is a national thing. I don't know if Massachusetts schools have that as well. But that sort of sparked this like lifelong like drive to be in science, to keep asking questions and to be able to design experiments or build things, you know, that were gonna solve scientific problems, biological problems. I think that's, you know, that all came from that first like 9th grade bio class that I took.
Super. Well, great. Anybody have any more questions? Before we wrap up, I'll give everyone a second to enter anything else into the chat. And if not, I want to thank everyone for joining today. This is a great discussion at the end. And thank you, Sean, for your willingness and I'll come back on video, time to share with us your background.
Absolutely.
It's really helpful. And so for everybody who's on, we're doing this for the next 2 weeks. I think our last speaker series is on Tuesday the 9th. So you can join us next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 3:30. And if anybody's interested in learning more from Sean or more about other speakers that we might be able to bring to you, please email us at info@scifair.com, and we'd be happy to explore getting more resources out to you. So great. Thanks for joining us. Again, thank you so much, Sean, for your time. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you, guys. One thing I would love to leave you guys with, to especially all the high schoolers that are on, make sure that there's something else that you love doing that you still do in addition to science. Make sure that there's, you know, a hobby or something that you really love or cherish doing that you maintain as you keep on in your educational career, because I think sometimes science can be really disheartening when things don't work or experiments keep failing time after time after time. So having something that is not science that you can look forward to and that you have as an outlet, I think is really great, and I think has been really crucial for me as I've, you know, built my career as a scientist.
Do you want to tell us more about what that might be for you?
I mean, there's a few things. I think just sports in general. So I'm a big skier. I grew up playing hockey because I'm from Western New York, and hockey was super big there. So any winter sport in general is sort of where I gravitate towards. But I also bike and run and swim a lot still. And then I've always loved drawing and painting. So I don't do a ton of that, but when I can, I think that's still something that I really gravitate towards, that helps me shut my brain off, or at least my science brain, and put a different brain on, or turn a different brain on. So that would be just a small few parting words, I think, for all the high schoolers, middle schoolers that are on.
It's great. We actually have one more question that came in while we were talking, so I hope you don't mind.
Yeah, no, not at all.
I always thought that biomed engineering was about making medical devices. How does strain engineering involve biomed engineering?
Great question. Yeah, no, I think when I started my graduate program too, my mom was like, so you're going to make fake arms and limbs and stuff, right? And new tissues. So I think biomedical engineering is kind of a broad category. You know, people that I went to graduate school with did electrical engineering focused biomed. So they made MRIs, whereas I sort of went more the molecular biology route, or I guess the synthetic biology route now. But I would argue that all of that is engineering, right? So I'm taking small biological pieces and building things on a nano or micro scale within a cell. Whereas, you know, some of my biomed colleagues might be taking, you know, huge sets of wires or like, you know, pieces of machinery to be able to build, you know, arms for surgery, so that we can have essentially all mechanical surgeries where the surgeon doesn't even have to go into the operating room anymore. So I think the gamut is quite wide with biomedical engineering, which sometimes can be bad because it's hard to focus yourself sometimes. But I think because I had that bio background for undergrad, that sort of focused me more on like the smaller scale side of biomedical engineering. But yeah, no, that's super great question.
Great. Well, thanks. Thanks again. Thanks for your questions, everyone. And looking forward to seeing you guys on another call coming up next week. Thanks again, Sean.
Yeah, you're
Appreciate
welcome,
it.
Helen. Take care, everyone.
Bye.